Hello and welcome to Property Question Time. I'm Stephen Galpin and this is a show where you can have your property related questions answered by our team of property experts. And joining me today is John Reynolds, CEO of Titan Property Developments. Hello John.
Hi Stephen.
And Jamie Pritchard, Director of Glenhawk, Transitional Finance Providers.
Hi Stephen.
Good, well, very good to have you on the show. John, we're going to start with you. With regard to the responsibilities of a developer, it would seem that the latest government directive will extend the responsibility for up to 15 years, particularly in respect of suitability of, and safety of materials. Do the panel think this to be fair and, more importantly, practical?
Oh, that's an interesting one. I mean, if you're covering all developers, I mean, the large developer, the big national house builders with their own construction teams and everything that's in-house, maybe that's potentially practical. It doesn't seem to work for the smaller developer, the medium-sized developer, where at any one time, you could be developing a lot of property, holding back because of market conditions. And so from a practicality point of view, depending on your staff count and what you can actually enforce and guarantee for 15 years is...
Well, I think the bigger question is, are they going to be there in 15 years?
In this current market, I mean,
even if you go back years, I can remember I'd been advised many times, whatever development you do, ring fence it, have it in an individual company. Once that company's fulfilled its purpose, get rid of it.
Well, even though I'm associated as Titan Property, all my individual projects are in SPVs, so that would relate to me, which is sort of what I'm saying. There's another key aspect to this as well, which is, and I think this has come on the back of the Grenfell Tower disaster, very much so. So there's a lot of panic. There's a lot of blame that's kind of trying to be portioned. RICS, the Royal Institute of Chartered Surveyors, have tried to bring in the EWS1 form, which has made a mess of things. I've certainly been on the receiving end. Anyone trying to sell an apartment, we talked about it in previous programs, right? It's a problem. But the thing for me is that there's still a lot out there to be determined on the materials being used and whether they are actually right. And in 15 years' time, something that has been shown to be the right thing to be using now could actually end up being a problem, whether it's external cladding or certain materials that are used, because it's being heavily researched now and we're using what is accredited and tick boxed off now. That might not be the case.
Exactly.
So where does that blame then go to? If you are a developer that's achieved building regs, successfully completed a development according to today, and 6 years' time, 7 years' time, it's front page news as, you can't use this material.
Well, you see,
how will that work?
You see, the next thing that's going to run on from that is these guys are going to get blamed for lending the money on it. Yeah,
well, that's where RICS have tried to protect them in the nicest way. But then it feels like it's all coming back on the developer. A lot of it is, we've talked again in previous programs about bringing solar panels and air source heat pumps in, and it's not being subsidised by anyone other than the developer paying for it. This feels like that element of, well, the lenders have panicked because if you're about to lend on a block and what's the external wall cladding system and so on, will protect the lenders. And I get that, rightly so, but the developer then is left totally exposed. Well, we're the ones building. We're building to conform to what building regs stipulate. And
if people see a chink of a way out of this, and I'm not for 1 minute going to offer what I think is the solution to this, because I think for a leaseholder it's very difficult, I think for a developer it's very difficult, for a lender I think it's difficult, but I'm just thinking back to the practicalities of life. What used to be the case, if something went wrong with your car, you'd ring up the finance company and say, I'm not paying anymore, this car's broken, it's got this wrong, that wrong, and they go, okay. And your financier would take it up with the manufacturer or the garage or whatever. And I can just see a little chink of this going to start happening in the property world. Well, they shouldn't have given me a mortgage on it, should they? They insisted I had a report on it, they had a look at it. Why can't I rely on their skills to make sure I'm living in a place that's safe?
I mean, I can relate to, in part, that, not quite the answer to the question, but permitted development and conversion of apartments office buildings to apartments, which I've done a lot of. I've had major surveyor issues where I think it's easier for the surveyors to just turn around and say, let's just not lend. So I've had proximity to light industrial, I've had lack of sales demand, even though it's the person applying for the mortgage that wants to buy. that's actually instructed the surveyor. The surveyor is then and I think that's an overarching, bigger internal picture within the surveying companies that are saying actually it's just easier not to lend because they've had issues with developments that have been done that are not up to standard, and they found out after the event, they found that there's poor specification or there's not a window in the bedroom. They haven't checked it properly. So actually, there's probably a bigger picture problem there that extends to the lenders.
We could be throwing the baby out of the bathwater here, couldn't we, as well? Because the last time I checked, we still haven't got enough homes in this country for people to live in. So if you're kicking the SME developers and to the point of where they're going to say, how much is it going to hit my profit at the end? And actually, for 15 years, I'm going to be worried about if there's going to be any changes to the criteria or that material is going to be seen as defunct, then the SMEs are going to be jumping out of the market. We need them.
You see, the other interesting thing here, Jamie, we live in a society where you need tax income to keep the country running, to keep everybody safe and stable and provide the services you need. Now, if I was developing today and I saw this, I'm going to be responsible for 15 years, I'd want a huge amount of my profits from that development putting on ice, being free from tax, being set down as a reserve for the next 15 years.
Yeah.
How do you like that, Mr. Chancellor?
He doesn't like that very much.
Yeah. Not going to happen, no.
But that's what's going to be the argument. You want to keep me on the line, I need to reserve the money. And the only way I can reserve the money is out of profit, so don't you dare be taxing me.
I still think you should be PM.
Do you? All right. Yeah. I think there might be one or two that disagree with you.
Yeah.
I'm on the fence, Stephen.
Okay.
But the point you're making is that it's all coming back on the developer. And that risk element, and Jamie's just made the point as well, is it actually could put people off. I could look at that as a real onerous issue that would stop me wanting to do a development because that's going to hang over me for 15 years.
When all's said and done, forgive me for going back on this, but it's a little bit like the crunch that we had in 2008 to 10, round about those times. We suffered here. Mortgage deposits went up because they wanted higher stress testing, there was less lending, all sorts of things. Was it our fault? No, it wasn't. It was the Americans who were putting together these collection of mortgage portfolios, building them up with people that haven't got a prayer of making repayments and then flogging the whole thing as a package. It wasn't our fault. I feel quite strongly about that. And I think if we're not careful, the same thing's happening here. All this is coming down as sort of inferred criticism of developers. But actually, in the case of Grenfell, I mean, I don't want to preempt the inquiry, but it seems to be, from what we read in the papers, it was the council that initiated this work.
Yeah. Yeah.
Right? It was the council that initiated it, and it's that same council that was in control of the building regs. So I'm not sure it's all together down to developers all the time. But there we are. We'll move on. Jamie, I'm about to secure some bridging or transitional finance. There we are. Somebody else who's up to date with the with the sound bites. Some transitional finance for my development project prior to deciding what to do with long-term finance I need. Is it just a question of rates when selecting a lender, or are there other considerations I should take into account? In other words, I suppose this is going to come back to your regulated and non-regulated business again, isn't it?
It comes down to lots of things in this, and does it always come down to the rate? No, it doesn't. It's not to say that something that costs you a lot more, you're not going to go for potentially the cheaper option, but let's go through each part. First part is, don't go into a bridge unless you know what you're going to be, how you're going to exit it, or at least have contingent exits. So the question, although it may have just been worded that way, says, I'm going to take a bridge before I decide what I'm going to do later on. I would more plan what you're going to do and reverse engineer it, and then do take out the bridge in for that reason. My underwriters will look at not putting someone on a bridge unless they don't need it. So if they don't need it, I turned down a regulated case earlier today because I said, they can get a long-term mortgage on that. There's no reason why they should be taking bridging finance out. Unless you give me a good reason why they should jump onto it.
And for example, without quoting perhaps the actual case, but why would they try and seek bridging when a longer-term solution is readily available to them?
Well, the answer that I was potentially looking for to come back was that they needed, it was a distress sale, they needed to do it for speed. They've been given a deadline by the vendor. so they weren't able to get for the long-term finance in time. But the answer didn't come back like that. The criteria they were using it for, I knew that they could get on a long-term mortgage, so that's why I turned it down in that regard. To your other part, which is the most important part of the question, you shouldn't be just looking at the cheapest thing. Same way that, you know, when I was advisor back in the day, looking at insurance, you know, the cheapest insurance is not always the best insurance for yourself, you know, life insurance and all these different things. And just because it's a cheap rate, are you secure in knowing that they actually got the trust in knowing that that funder, that lender, is actually going to complete on that deal? So there's lots of examples in the past. You know, we said about chancellors in the last answer. You know, a few chancellors back, they made some actions which caused financial institutions to be a little bit nervous, which actually put up the rates in different regards. But actually made some of the funders nervous, and they weren't actually completing on deals, and deals were changing. So it comes down to criteria and knowing that your deal fits. It comes down to actually charges. So actually the rate may be cheap, but could there be different charges at the back end, exit fees that some lenders have and don't? So all of these things need to come in, and an advisor will determine whether that's right for you as well. And it also comes down to actually, you know, what they will do if you do get into strife. What is the sort of forbearance looking at? What's the servicing? All those bits at the back. Now, I don't expect you to be ever going into a bridge thinking that you'll need those things, but knowing the good lender that you're getting into bed with is probably a really good thing. An advisor, or, you know, in John's regards, you know, knowing somebody and knowing the lenders to use is probably really good.
It's quite interesting. It's quite pleasing to sort of hear you say that, because I mean, I had my eyes open a little bit about car insurance, for instance. Like, it does have an effect on your premium, apparently. The point at which you ask for a quote for renewal. You know, if you,
I didn't know that.
Yeah, if you ask for a quote, I think it's 28 days before the renewal date. There is a consideration that says you're somebody there that is considering what they're doing, rather than knee-jerk reaction the day before. So therefore, you're a slightly better bet. And in the same way, Jamie's saying, look, I'm looking for various points around the loan, not just whether you can build the thing, not whether you can just sell it, but why? Yeah. And I think that's a great question. I think that is a perfect example of responsible lending.
Yeah. Yeah. I agree with that.
You know,
totally.
I think that's where we are. Okay, well, that's all we've got time for in this half of the show. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join John Reynolds and Jamie Pritchard after the break, when we'll be answering more of your questions. Hello and welcome back to part 2 of Property Question Time with John Reynolds and Jamie Pritchard. Welcome back, guys. John, I'm a small developer and have always undertaken projects close to home. What are some of the pitfalls I should watch for when undertaking developments further afield?
Need
to be a bit braver, I think.
I've done both through my career. I've done a lot of close to home developments, and I've gone really quite far. And I think, to answer the question, if you're going to go far away, you ultimately need a team. You need people on the ground, and you need to know the area, having researched it, because to flip that back to when you do something in the area that you live, you know it. You know the local people, you know the market, you know all the idiosyncrasies that go on within that market as well. So that gives you an edge. And it might just be that if you're just doing houses in that area that you can compare to other houses, then it's safe, it's going to work. Where I've gone far away is because I've seen a niche, I've seen an opportunity. So the office to resi permitted development, the opportunity that came in 2013, I jumped on that. What an opportunity. And living in Bournemouth at the time, I wanted to also follow the Crossrail, that sort of M3 corridor. I could see there was going to be a movement of people moving from London to be able to get properties at a more affordable price, and again, using that permitted development. So I formed a team around that. It also meant there was an awful lot of travelling, there was an awful lot of late nights, and setting up new relationships around doing that. So you're clearly taking a calculated risk if you are going to go further away. But if the opportunity, for whatever reason, is good, it might just be that it's a distressed asset that's come to you through a contact, or someone that gives you the opportunity, then you can take it forward. But you've got to have a good team.
I have a friend that says, if you can't see the telecom tower, don't do it. But I think that was born out of this business of London developers looking at somewhere like, well, I won't say the towns, but let's say either very much southern towns or very northern towns, and thinking, Christ, that's cheap, you know, compared with, I need to dash in there quick. But they forget the sort of logic of, you've got to look at the demographics and look what the wages and the employment, you know, situations are there.
It's all relative, right?
And on top of which, also, the one they always forget is the sales rates, which are, the further you go away from London, are actually usually the slower you find. Do you agree with that?
I do, and actually to parallel that, you know, depends on what your exit is, which Jamie will be very much all over. So if you're looking to do a development of 6 houses or 10 flats, whatever it might be, and you're going to keep them, then, you know, that's slightly different, because that might be a yield play in an area that you couldn't get in the view of the BT Tower.
Yeah.
It's not going to happen.
No.
So there's a very good reason to go away, and I know that I've done that and retained units, but you've just got to research and know that market.
The due diligence is so important. You've got to be thinking of, you know, this question could be about, actually, do I buy to-lets in different areas? So it could be not even a development question. And you saw this around 2016 onwards, where obviously the taxation has changed, and people go, let's go and chase down the yield in Manchester, Leeds, and everywhere else in the north, without actually really knowing those areas at all and understanding them. So I couldn't agree with you more.
And of course, also, if you're on the buy-to-let kick, you know, your management costs are going to be quite a lot higher in areas if you're having to do things remotely. I know that's not quite the question, because he's talking about sort of development away from home. But as you say, it can boil down to the exit strategy. It might be development to keep, you know.
The advice is transferable between either owning a portfolio there, because that's long-term, to having the developments, and you know, it's how hands-on they are, and it's that team around you, that crack team.
Oh, massively. I mean, I was fortunate enough to be working with a London-based architect firm, and the 2 guys that I prolifically worked with moved back to where they're from, Newcastle way, and then actually were bringing me opportunities and knew that location. It's where they were born and bred. So they actually then had a project management team underneath them, and I'm involved in one right now, 31 apartments. A slight change of use from sort of elderly care that then moved to residential, and we'll keep them. But we've been able to stress test that market and get comfortable. And you mentioned sales rates. The other thing, of course, in some locations, I think Birmingham and Manchester are guilty of at the moment, is if you're going to keep these units, make sure there's not a saturation of either sales or certainly the rental market, because what you might see as advertised might not be being achieved because there's an oversupply.
But you make, you make a huge point there about sort of local knowledge, though. I mean, I know the same person that gave me that advice about Telecom Tower would also say that as a developer or as somebody who's refurbing at any sort of scale, you can't do it without the support of your local agent, because that local agent is going to support your valuations. He's going to advise valuers who knock on the door and say, what do you think about this? They're going to have the local insight into employment and progress strategies. So it's very important.
I've seen some investors as well trying to buy properties, and they're thinking, that's a great opportunity. I can turn that into a HMO. They're not even thinking about Article 4 restrictions, and their advisors not even thinking about Article 4 restrictions, because maybe they're based in London. They don't know that Birmingham or Salford's got an Article 4 restriction. So it's all these bits that play into it as well. Yeah.
It's just being really diligent and researching and making sure. But of course, if you know your local area, that's great. It just might not be practical to be able to do that. So you've got to get it right.
I mean, it's quite funny. I don't see them any longer up until I think the late 90s. No, in fact, it's the early 2000s. We used to have a book in London which was called the London Property Market, I think. I don't know whether you've ever seen it, but it is a street-by-street guide of the history of that street in terms of prices, development, changes, different boroughs and all the rest of it. It was such a good document, but I think with the last recession we had it, like a lot of other things, it disappeared. But,
I've heard people talking about it. Yeah,
I think I've got every issue up till about 2004 or 5. But anyway, there we are. Mustn't reminisce, must we? Jamie, your question. I'm considering taking out a bridging loan. However, my associate previously had a bad experience with the lender he chose. Are bridging loan companies regulated in the same way as normal long-term funders?
So I think you mentioned it earlier, actually, and you accused me, rightly so, of being a responsible lender.
I said responsible, not irresponsible.
You said responsible. You said responsible lender, which has so. Again, you're going to have certain lenders where they've had different bad experiences as well, and I throw it back. What is that bad experience that they've had? Have they been overpromised something? Have they been overpromised something by their advisor?
Or have they failed to perform?
Or have they failed to give in the, usually the pay slips or whatever materials that they need, documentation, to actually complete on it. So I would put it down to your customer to saying, find out what they're looking to do. Bridging lenders can be really good and being used more and more year on year. Finding the right one for yourself is off the advice of a good advisor that will be able to help you with that, a good specialist advisor. Regulation. So if you're taking out a buy-to-let with a long-term lender, buy-to-let is actually a non-regulated product. Same way bridging, for the most part, is a non-regulated product. However, what you'll have, including my firm, is lenders who also do regulated bridging, so regulated and unregulated. So what we'd say is, even though we've got different types of regulation and looking at both those products, we will always look at things as a responsibility and bring it back to that point. We're a responsible lender. We wouldn't get you into a bridge unless we knew that you could have viable exit routes to come off that. And we want to be there for the long run. We want not just John's development, next development, we want his next few developments. So that repeat business and customer service is really key for us.
Well, that brings me to a point. It's something that always concerns me. I can remember years ago being with a building society for many, many years with many, many mortgage that are taken out with them, both before they turned themselves into a bank and after. And I can remember going to them after several times and saying, "Oh, right, I'd like another mortgage. And I've been with you so many years and so many times." And they're just like, "So? And?" And that loyalty had no longer any value. My commitment to them was not valuable. Their interest in keeping me as a customer was not valuable. And I hasten to add, it wasn't because I didn't pay the mortgage or anything. But, so my question to you, Jay, so does a broker for bridging value that loyalty of a customer? So in other words, is it worth, say, John, for instance, building that relationship with you, or is it just a one-off thing based on the particular project and then goodbye?
I think with a lot of these things, when it comes down to bridging finance, there is a relationship to be had. And because John, it's done lots of the time, let's just say it out loud, bridging is for fast finance, because you want to complete it. Now, it could be that actually it's the right finance, so it could be that John needs to take time on it and as a development for the next stage of things, but John wants to get comfortable with what we're going to be looking at each time. And because we know John's circumstances, yes, we'll still need to do checks on him, so it can't be John took out a mortgage 7 years ago with us and now his circumstances are exactly the same. It's a responsibility for us to make sure that his credit and everything else is the same from there. But by building up a relationship, we know John, we can actually get comfortable with that he's redeemed on loans and actually will repay again. So there is a relationship to be had, but dare I say it, John should actually be playing the field and actually having relationships with different types of lenders out there because of rates, different types of lending that we will do. Not all lenders lend on the same thing. We're not the Henry Ford School of lenders. We will lend on different, we'll do ground up, where some will do different types of refurbishment projects. So John will know that through either himself or the advisors that he's got, but there's definitely a relationship to be had.
Okay, well, that's all we've got time for on today's show. So thank you very much for watching. Thank you very much to John Reynolds and Jamie Pritchard. Thank you both. Great answers to the questions. Thank you. I'm Stephen Galpin. Join me again next time on Property Question Time.